Well, here we are with another group of photos. I got to looking through all the photos I've taken, and I found so many that were so interesting. I just figured I'd do a couple of presentations on this, and I've got a lot of photos I hadn't even touched on yet. But we're going to start with this one here. This was on a van that belonged to one of the computer science instructor at the college over there, and she had a little dog that got under there and chewed the oxygen sensor off to where it wasn't nothing but a nub on both sides. And so we put another oxygen sensor in there, and she said she was going to look after her dog a little better. And she came back in there the following week, and the exact same thing had happened. I don't know why these critters and these dogs and stuff like to chew on wires. There was a Ford pickup that came into the dealership when I was there, and this I may have mentioned it before, but this guy's next door neighbor had a dog that kept chewing the wires under his truck, and that dog went under there and he made a mess out of this big wire harness under the truck. And I got under there and I split the thing, and I got my soldering iron and all that stuff and put it all back together with heat shrink and taped it up. Even put fresh loom on it and all that. And he put it back out there, and the next time the dog chewed it, he did an even better job. And he jerked on some hoses that got messed up, and he also chewed that same big wire harness, and it was about 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter, chewed it in two so that it was just hanging over the frame, on both sides. In other words, there was a little section of the wire harness about 1 foot long. Anyway, the first time we fixed that guy's truck, it was expensive. The second time it was even more expensive because we had to replace the harness. It was bad enough to where there wasn't no fixing it without spending a heck of a lot of time that he didn't want to have to pay for it. There's not any real labor time that you can, in other words, there's no set labor cost that you can do for that unless you just want to. But what we did at the dealership for something like that you just had to work on until it was fixed was we do what we call M time, which was basically clock time. You clocked off and on when you clocked on, you'd worked on it until you went to lunch, you clocked off. Of course, we were supposed to do that on all our work orders. Anyway, finally, on this lady's vehicle, after I put that second oxygen sensor in there, I got a piece of steel from the welding department and bent it and put some little ears on it and drilled them, and I basically covered this thing up with a kind of a steel splash pan so that this dog couldn't get to those wires anymore, and she didn't have that trouble anymore after that. This is a choke on a '69 Ford pickup we worked on. I mean, I drove vehicles that had chokes on them back in the day, and you kind of had to know how to do that. You pull your choke to start it, and then as you warmed it up within the first minute or so, you worked the choke back shut, you pushed it back in, and that's actually a factory choke on a '69. I think up until '72, Ford pickup still had a choke knob that you had to pull on the dash, and I believe in '73 they went with a automatic choke, sorts. And there was a bunch of different ways they did that, but these vehicles, a lot of them got to where they were like your lawnmower. You know how you're the only one that knows how to start your lawnmower. If somebody else comes along, even if they're pretty good at getting stuff started, you know the combination. You know how you have to pull the choke, how you have to spin it and wait and do this and that and the other, and you finally get it going, and then it mows the grass good the rest of the day. But I mean, I've got a F525 John Deere mower out here, and it doesn't really take any special. Heck, it's a '91 model, but basically, it got to the point that it had a little starter solenoid on it, and a little small motor starter. It's got a little Kawasaki engine on there with an oil filter and all. Pretty cool commercial grade mower. But anyway, it would click, click, click when I turned the starter, and then I would take the some little something and reach down in there with I don't raise the seat and I'll reach there, and while I was holding the clutch with one foot and turning the thing, I'd bump the starter and then it would spin over. Well, there was a voltage drop issue I was hearing about that was sort of like a recall program on those things when they were still kind of new. But as it turned out, I can't remember, it seemed like it wouldn't even click, and I said, well, I'm going to have to I found out that if I bypass this wiring, going to the starter and just put voltage straight to it, it would spin the starter. So I put me a rubber hooded push button on there, and I soldered it into the wires that were leaving the ignition switch, and that thing always spins just as soon as I push the button now, so that made a really good deal. The shop manual for that dadgum lawnmower looks like a shop manual for a car. I mean, it's It's granted it's a single shop manual, it doesn't have several of them, but it is a really thick book, about 1.5 inches thick, and it's got the wiring schematic. You wouldn't believe how complicated the wiring is on a 91 John Deere lawnmower. And it's got an electromagnetic clutch under there, kind of like an air conditioner clutch that you gotta, that you turn on and it kick. I've already had to replace that darn thing once, and that was $200 for that. But it's a really good mower, and I really like it. Long and the short of it is, how'd I get off talking on the lawnmower? I got to cut the grass today. I guess that's why I was on my mind. I don't mind cutting the grass, and I don't mind working on the lawnmower, but I don't like having to work on the lawnmower when it's time to cut the grass. You know what I mean? That gets in my craw. I don't appreciate that. And occasionally we have to do that, The clamping diode is really important. That's an old one, like on a 72 model Chevy. They had a diode. It was just naked there that you could see. You could see that diode right there. And of course, anybody that knows anything about diodes knows it's like a one-way valve for electricity. And what they do is they put it in there in such a way so that when you de-energize the compressor clutch and the magnetic field collapses across those windings, then that diode will provide a path for that current that thing to chase its tail, so it doesn't send a spike back into the any electronics that are on there, and it will do that if that diode is bad. Now the diode can get shorted and actually start popping the fuse and all that. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. If the diode opens up, you might wind up with issues with your electronic components responding to those spikes. I have seen that on the. There was an Aerostar I worked on one time, and the starter relay on some of these newer Fords looked just like the starter relay on the old ones, only it had an internal clamping diode built into it. Your idle air controls on some of your Fords, they had some of them had internal clamping diodes too. But the long and the short of it was, I had an Aerostar I worked on one time, and it would cut up and do wacky stuff. It was sometimes you started and it'd run good, sometimes you started and it'd run terrible. You just never knew how it was going to run when you started it. And I noticed that somebody had put a brand new starter solenoid on it, starter relay, one of the bolts on old fender, And I took my scope and hooked it up to that darn thing, and I saw that whenever I energized it and let it de-energize, there was about a huge spike. I mean, I can't remember what it was. It was 200 or 300 volts that was coming screaming out of that thing, going right back into the engine controller because it's tied into that circuit. It basically used the neutral safety switch. Whenever you were putting it in drive, it would take take the neutral safety switch would take the starter solenoid out of the loop, and it read that ground to see if it was in on that same circuit, to see if it was in the park or neutral, or if it was in drive or something like that. Okay, so with it in park, it would see that ground. With it in reverse, it wouldn't see it. Within neutral, it would see it. So that's why it wouldn't know it was in park and neutral. But anyway, when that thing would spike, that would go screaming back into the engine controller and mess with the data for a little bit. Didn't ever damage the PCM as far as I know, but whenever I replaced the starter relay, that took care of that problem and all that. But anyway, that clamping diode is really important. I had told a story one time about a Daleville Cablevision truck. When they came in there, and they kept having to replace the radio in the truck, and it was because they had an air conditioner style clutch pulling the power takeoff for the bucket, for the hydraulic pump for the bucket. And every time they'd switch it off and on, with the engine running, that they get a spike to go back into their little AM/FM radio. It was this basic truck. It didn't even have a tape player or nothing, or a CD or whatever. Anyway, it would scream in there and screw the radio up. And they had replaced the radio over the new car department 2 or 3 times and kept messing the radio up anyway. And so I had an idea that I felt like I might know what was going on. I got in there and I got into the wiring with my scope, and I turned things off and on. When I turned that power takeoff clutch off and on, I saw a massive spike. And I said, well, that's got the deal on that. All I had to do was add a clamping diode, just like that one right there. If you put it in there backwards, it'll blow a fuse, but you got to put it in there the right way. I'll let you guys figure out which way is the right way, but it's not hard to determine. All right, this right here is me on a, seems to me like this was one of those little GM Pontiac Aztec maybe, that was throwing a PO401 code because the EGR passages were stopped up. And I got a piece of an old park brake cable, that had threads up on this end, and I cut the cable and, frayed it out on the end a little bit, and I put it in my drill, and I went down in that hole and I cleaned out the carbon and crud out of there so we could have good EGR flow. Remember, if you try to flow EGR and you know the EGR valve's opening but the engine doesn't change sounds, you know you got an EGR flow issue, and typically it's going to be something like this right here on this Ford pickup. You see them big mountains of sludge that come up in there, that, you know, because of the EGR. I mean, it just gets, it's a gummy, sludgy mess that likes to clog up all kinds of stuff. It also clogs up these little ports where it's got one feed in each, like on this 3.8. If one of them, if all of them clog up but one, that one will misfire when the EGR valve opens. You'll have a misfire code and it'll shut the injector down while that's going on, and you'll be really confused about that if you're not familiar with how that works and all. Another thing, on the gasoline direct injection engines, a lot of the times you'll have some carbon buildup on the intake valves for various different reasons. You know, of course, Ford and Toyota have started putting MPI and GDI injectors in there to kind of keep that washed off, but they have different strategies in the way that they work. But the GDI engines are susceptible to the same kind of carbon buildup as the other ones. You might remember the olefins that we had that were piled up on the valves back in the 80s whenever they were putting those little black particles of olefin in gas with the idea it was going to keep the injector clean. Well, that was a disaster because those little pieces of olefin would get trapped in the injector and stop it up whenever it closed up, get baked on there where they wouldn't clean off. And furthermore, that olefins would pile up on the valves and make it have cold running problems. I've talked about that before a little bit. But a lot of the times when you've got carbon buildup in your intake, you know, in your tumble valves and all that, you know, the manifold control valves, that, you know, like a lot of times you'll have these valves that will basically close most of the air off so that whenever it's idling, right down there, just leave a little bitty port in that flapper so that whenever the air goes in, it goes screaming in there a lot faster. And then whenever you need more throttle, it opens that up. Well, those get all sludged up and everything. It can cause problems. And PCV steam is what, you know, floats around in there and condenses on things and all that. There are some of the particulates that come in through EGR that can cause that too. So there's all kinds of issues that has to be cleaned out. And that's one of the reasons that you do that kind of, you know, you have issues with, like that with GDI. Because anything, you know, anybody that's ever done any hot rod work and has ported and polished heads, you know, knows basically you want good airflow in there. However, you know, there are some these manifold runner control systems, like it started out in like the '89 Taurus show, that would basically have runners in there, I mean flappers in there that would shorten the runners and lengthen them, you know, based on, you know, what it needed for power and that kind of stuff. That's another story. This right here, you can see my crummy homemade tool that I made with some bolts and a piece of flat iron to use for Volkswagen tensioners. They make a really good tool you can buy. I think that was made by Lyle on Amazon, and that one there is a lot higher quality than this crummy cheap one that I made. But you know, if you don't want to have to wait for a tool to get there, you don't have to worry about ordering one. You basically can build you something that will work. Usually, I got another tool a little bit later I'm going to show you that I built too. This is me in 1975 building an engine on up in Montana, and that's my dad about that same year working in his shop down here in Alabama. This was in Montana, up here, way off up there in that part of the state. And I was a combine operator, but I was the only guy they had that really had any mechanical abilities, because I grew up with this guy, you know, and I kind of knew how to build engines and stuff. So, and I wasn't but like 18 years old at the time. So they jerks me out of the combine and they had me rebuild a couple of them gas burner engines that was in them trucks, you know. One way or another, the truck ran real good after you know, both of them did after I built it. So I had to pull the motors out of there and all that. Incidentally, when I was up in Montana in that Wolf Point area, the mosquitoes were worse up there than anything I'd ever seen anywhere else. And I lived down there in the marshy part of southeast Texas, close to Louisiana, where mosquitoes are, you know, you'd expect them to be really, really bad because of that marsh. Well, there was a little bit of places where there was open water up there in Montana, and we were having to pick that front part of that International Lodestar up and put it back on there after we put the engine back in. And it was close to dark, and the mosquitoes were real swoofed out there. And they got on my arms so thick that, I mean, and you couldn't wipe them off because you're carrying that big old thing. And when I wiped them off, it was just a bloody mess on my arm because of massive numbers of mosquitoes on both my arms and all that. It was some of the worst mosquitoes I ever seen. There's a lot of grasshoppers flying around up there too. I guess because they were eating the mosquitoes, I don't know. This was Clint Eastwood carrying a straight six engine in one of his Every Which Way But Loose movies. I thought that was a really interesting picture, because they may have made that engine lighter so that it looked like he was carrying it. But fellas, I've been around a lot of greasy old engines, and I'm sure they probably can make anything weigh 50 pounds and look like this. But that, and the way he's straining, it looks to me like he's genuinely carrying that engine. You might have seen that movie, but I thought that was a really good picture. However, as much of a macho people as we are, the wise mechanics will not risk damaging their back the way that he did on that. I love the way this camera just gets crazy and tries to, you know, get out of focus occasionally. All right, this right here, there was this, I think it was a Chevy Citation, and this friend of mine, his nephew was driving it, and it had quit out there by the credit union, and he called me over there to see if we could see what we needed to do to fix it. And when I opened the hood, and that boy had been driving that car, I saw these eggs in this nest under the hood. This is no joke. It was over on the passenger side, right there behind the headlight. And I guarantee you that hood, it was really, really hot that day. And that hood had been hot enough, it had been hot enough under the hood where it probably hard boiled them eggs. I mean, I don't know, they were, I got the nest out of there and the eggs and all that, but I had to take a picture of it first. And the wacky thing about it was I got my old 80 model Ford truck, and we dragged that thing over to this shop in Ozark, where I knew, you know, closer by than any other shop I had access to. And we got it up on the lift right after we pulled it over there, and we had kind of heated the transaxle. It was like a 20-mile pull. Heated the transaxle up. You could put your hand on the final ride. It was a little warm, you know. But it was a junky old car anyway. We had to replace the module, and the on that one, if I remember right, it was one of the ones that had the crank sensor mounted on the back of the module. It went inside of the block, you know, and you had to go under the back of the motor to do it. But anyway, we put him a coil and a module and a crank sensor on there, and it, you know, fired off. He never had any more trouble with it, at least until he got rid of it and all. Whenever tires are expired, and I've had other videos about this tire right here, whenever you look at these numbers, this was, it was in, see that, 04, 05. As I remember, that's the 4th week of 2005 when that one was made. And so, golly, that's confusing there. It could be the 5th week of 2004. You know, look that up, make sure I'm telling you right. That's stupid. I used to teach that. And whenever I see this one right here, you can tell though that that one there is out of whatever that number is. That one of those is going to be the number of weeks into the year it was, and the other is going to be the year model. And during looking at that right now, I can't remember which way it is, but one way or another, you can see all these cracks and all that. And even if a tire's been stored in a warehouse, in an air-conditioned warehouse with a bunch of other tires, and it still smells like a new tire, if it's beyond the age, if it's more than 6 years old, you don't need to be using that tire on anything. This is kind of the thing that happens on that. This was one of my students. He drove this 88 Blazer, and he was really happy with this thing. He had spent a bunch of time, you know, fixing the power windows and all that, and was fixing it up and all. One day, he didn't show up for class, and I sent him a text, and I said, "Where are you at, Daniel?" And he sent me a text back with this picture right here, and you can see the tread came off of one of his tires. If you look at these other tires, they're about the same age, and they all look really good. But the tires were so far expired, and the last thing on his mind was a tire throwing a tread and causing him to flip that thing over. Totaled it out. Didn't hurt him. He was okay. But that's one of the reasons you need to pay attention to those tires. Also, something else I covered in another PowerPoint is for years and years and years, we were always thinking that if you were going to just put 2 tires on and keep your slightly more worn tires, you always wanted to put the new tires on the front. That's what we were taught. That's what I was told all those years and all that. And I was talking about that one day, and one of my students was working at a Firestone store, and he says, "You're supposed to put the new tires on the back." And I said, "I've never heard that. I mean, you know, well, does it matter whether front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, what time of the year it is, anything like that?" And he goes, he says, "Well, and so I looked it up because that's what he was saying." I said, if this guy's coming from Firestone and they're telling him this, and Firestone's a tire store, they probably know more than I do. You know, humility means you basically realize that you don't know everything. And so I called up on the internet all of these different tire manufacturers, and every single one of them said, if you're putting 2 new tires on and you're keeping the old ones, put the new ones on the rear. keeps you from spinning out and crashing. And if you don't want to lose a lawsuit, always put the ones on the rear, because the manufacturer says to do that. And if you wind up in court, you can say the manufacturer told me to put it on the rear, and here it is in the internet, you know, on their page where they said always put new tires on the rear. If you even go to Walmart or Sam's, you'll see it on the wall up there. If you put 2 new tires on it, always put them on the rear. That's just a really important little piece of advice there. Everybody at some point or another, and I don't care who you are, has either done this or seen it done, or somebody double gasketed a filter because they didn't realize that gasket stuck. Of course, it's a good idea to look at the thing and have a light under there instead of working in the dark so you can see what's happened. What I used to tell my people is, when you screw a filter off, look at that thing and see if the gasket is still on it. If the gasket is not on there, you better find out where it is, because if it's stuck up there, you need to get it off. I had one guy that went to work at the Toyota dealer. He was one of my people that was doing afternoon work over there, in a co-op work, if you want to call it that. And he changed oil over there and never had a bit of a problem at the Toyota place. He just changed oil, changed oil, changed oil. I mean, that's what they always, typically when you're a new guy, they start you out changing oil, then they work you up into brakes and into belts and hoses and the fast service. And then if you show any promise and your speed of work is good, then they'll usually run you on up the line. You know, they can tell if you have any kind of smarts about you when it comes to mechanical stuff by letting you do that kind of thing. Anyway, he came back over and one morning before he went to work, I had him doing oil change, and doggone if he didn't double gasket the oil filter on one, got oil all over the floor up there. You got to be paying attention to that. First time I double gasketed one was when I was on wheat harvest, and that was, believe it or not, about the same time I was building that engine. I had to change oil on the combine. You couldn't see the filters on the combine. They were between the hopper and there was 2 of them, 2 big filters on that Allis-Chalmers combine. And you had to use a strap wrench to get, with a extension with a strap on it to get down there and screw them oil filters off. Well, part of my problem was I had made myself some chili and didn't cook it enough, had food poisoning, and I was really sick. And I really didn't want to be up there doing that anyway, because I just didn't really feel like it. But the boss says, no, you'll feel better if you'll go ahead and work this out. Well, I got up there and I screwed the oil filter off and back on, and when I cranked it up, oil went everywhere, switched it right off right away. And I should have put a note on it or disabled it or something, but hey, I was only 18. So I told the other combine operator, I says, this thing has got a bad oil leak and is low on oil. We ain't got no more oil because the boss man's in town. When he comes back, make sure you tell him this thing is out of oil. And it needs oil put in it before anybody starts it back up. If I'd had any sense, I'd have took the battery cable off or put the key in my pocket or something like that. I didn't do that. Somebody else came back. He came back from town the next morning when we were loading up. That was all forgotten, and somebody started the motor up and burnt the engine up. So anyway, it had to have a crankshaft after that, but I guess that was the breaks of the ball game. But I learned a heck of a lot from that 18-year-old experience that I had. I mean, I could rebuild an engine, but I double gasketed an oil filter. Part of it was I couldn't see down in there. The other part of it because I was sick when I did the job, So anyway, a lot of times we like to tell the story like we never made any mistakes, but everybody has made a dumb mistake sooner or later. Got to figure that out. This is a little homemade gauge testing thing I used with a piece of speaker wire. And I basically got the connector that I cut off of an old fuel pump. And I basically would plug that into the wire harness. And on the other end of that thing, I had this potentiometer. You see a little potentiometer right there? And I had a potentiometer that was spec'd with about the same kind of, with something that was within the window that it would operate the gauge. So I could plug that in back there where the fuel pump and gauge were plugged in, and I could with that long wire, I could go up there and sit in the seat, and I could turn the key on. I could turn it because of the slosh part of it. You turn the key off, you reset your little pot, you turn it back on. You can actually measure the pot too with your meter while you're doing this, and you can watch the gauge to see if it works. It's like a homemade gauge tester. Now, there's been gauge testers made for years that have 3 little pots on them where you can turn them this way and that and dial in the resistance you want and all that. I just needed that one pot, I got the idea from that, but I made my own that way. And basically the way it works is this right here. You got your gauge right here. This is like on a 99 GMC. Because it's basically talking to the powertrain control module, which is sending information to the cluster and all that. But it still works. So what you can do there, you unplug that, and this little potentiometer you see right here, you hook it up just 2 of the legs. It doesn't matter which 2. You don't want it to hook it to the outside legs. You want it to hook it to the center and one of the side legs, because that's going to give you a changing resistance. Of course, depending on the knob, you just turn one way or the other depending on which side leg you use, but you're always going to use a center leg and one side leg. You can also use this to test to see when your cooling fan comes on vehicles. I've talked about that before in here. You can use it to trick it into starting whenever you've got a temperature sensor like an IAT or something that's not reading right and all that. But I used to take it and plug it into, I would demonstrate it by plugging it into this Oldsmobile that we had over there. Of course, they have one of them two-step sensors on it. But what I could do with, you don't have to have the engine running really hot. You can crank the engine up. If the engine's running, you could dial that thing in to the temperature on your scan tool and watch the fan kick on to see if it would or not. A lot of people don't realize it, but some of these GM vehicles don't turn on the fan until 228 degrees, which sounds awfully scary hot to me, but that's just what they choose. Anyway, if you don't want to get the vehicle really hot, you can dial it with that potentiometer hooked up to your engine coolant sensor, and you know, with the engine running. On some of them it'll work without the engine running. On some of them you have to have the engine running. When in doubt, start the engine cold, dial in a hot temperature, see if the fan comes on. You can even see when it comes on, when it goes off, and all that kind of thing. Back whenever I was working at the Ford dealer, I would take a meter and I would back probe the engine coolant temperature sensor, and I noticed on a Taurus the coolant fan would come on at 450 millivolts on that engine coolant temperature, and then I forgot what it would go off at. I mean, but I know 450 millivolts when it come on, so I could warm it up and look for 450 millivolts. If I saw it go below 450 millivolts significantly, then and the fan didn't come on, I knew I had some kind of a fan problem. Then I would check for the fan motor to be open or something like that. All right, now then, this right here is a Ranger 4-wheel drive hub lock removal tool. That is a strange looking thing. Raise your hand if you've used one of these things before. We were working on this Ranger one time, and we had to replace a brake rotor or something. I can't remember what it was. And it's very, I mean, you might build you something if you've got the patience to do it. This is a $100 tool, but that's how it hooks up. Basically, each one of those hooks around here, and it basically pulls all of those little ears out at the same time, and you use a slide hammer connected to that, and you pop it off of there. And then whenever you take the tool off, when you go to put it back on, you slide it back in, it goes click and all that. So, but that was something, that was a $100 tool. We bought it and used it. The first time I ever ran into one of those Rangers, you will almost not get that hub off unless you're smarter than I am without that tool. That's something you just about got to have. And that's like a mid-2000s Ranger or something like that, if I remember right, 98 to mid-2000s, I think, if they got a vacuum locking hub and it's a Ranger. This right here, you know, how about that gas smell? You know, this person coming in, I got a bad gas smell. Well, you get up here and you pull the tank off and you realize that this guy has run a screw in there to mount an amplifier, and he ran a screw right on into the gas tank right there. That was a fairly easy to figure out when it was all, you know, he filled it up and see gas dripping out from under there. You go looking for where it is, and it turned out you know, you know how many times people just find a place to run a screw in without thinking about what's behind it, and that's what this guy did here. He said, that's a nice flat place I can mount my amplifier. So he runs that self-drilling screw in there, and it's self-drilled right on into the gas tank, you know. Everybody about seen that too. This right here, if you've seen this before, there is the Jeep, the 4-liter Jeeps have got this oil filter adapter. Now there is a way you can do away with this, but if you're just wanting to fix it by taking this, that's a big old T60 Torx. You got to screw that out of there, and there's a gasket right here that loves to leak, and it's about the same size as the oil filter gasket that, you know, goes actually a little oil filter. But anyway, you got to be able to screw that out there. And look at the distance you got. You got this much distance to get a T60 Torx. Now somebody somewhere might make a special tool for this. I never even tried to look it up. But if you're like me, you wind up in a situation where you want to get a job done, and so you look around, you see what old wrench and what old tools you got in your box, you can grind around to make one. Well, this is what I did. I actually ground both sides of this T60 off where it fit real tight in this 23 millimeter wrench, and beat it down in there. And it was beat in there so hard that you could hardly get it out of there. Because you know, when do you use a 23 millimeter wrench anyway, you know? And that was with an old set of wrenches that we had. Anyway, we used that to go down in there and break that big T60 off. Then you screw it out of there, and then you replace the seal, screw it back in, and tighten it back up really good with this right here. Well, that's just a little homemade tool I was talking about too. always amazed me how some vehicles just kind of keep on running a long time after the bearing's gone, and this thing right here is still spinning on that shaft. And they come in with noise and squealing belts and all. When you open the door, you say, "My goodness, how did this run as long as it did until it got to this point?" You know. That was, you know, it was always fun looking in there to see what, you know, if you got one that's giving you a problem, and you have the idea that some of the accessories might be making the noise or something like that, even though you may not be able to see it move. I like to take the belt off, spin all the pulleys, see if I hear a noisy bearing or something like that. This one here had a bad bearing in this AC clutch idler thing, you know, the hub. And the engine, they thought the engine was locked up. You know, this girl that was in my program says, "Me and my dad are going to put a starter on my car." And I said, "Well, we can put a starter on there. Let's get it." You know, I sent some of my guys out there with a tow rope. We dragged her little old Pontiac in there. And when we got it, you could grab and try to turn the engine with the on the crank bolt with a breaker bar. And what you wound up with was you'd see the belt slipping on this thing. Everything else was turning, the belt slipped on that. So then you take the belt off, the engine starts right up. And I've known of shops that accidentally put engines in vehicles that had locked up water pumps and stuff like that. That is a real easy mistake to make if you're just assuming the engine's locked up. It's always a good idea to take the belts off and make sure the engine is actually locked up. Occasionally, the starter will foul up and make it seem like the engine's locked up. So it's just a tremendously good idea to take the belts off first, then pull the starter off and continually check the engine with the breaker bar just to see if it's actually locked up, because sometimes you'll replace the, you know, an engine that doesn't need to be replaced. And in some shops, if you sell the customer on the idea that they need an engine, and then you find out it doesn't, the owner of the shop may even want you to go ahead with the job just because he's already sold an engine, you know. And that puts you in kind of a moral dilemma, you know, if you're somebody that, you know, that's bothered by that kind of thing too. And it always bothered me. This right here, we can get a PO 446 on some of these expeditions and stuff back in the day, back in the late 90s. Because these things right here, if you live in a dusty environment, these big old evaporative canisters would get clogged up with dust. And you could actually stick your, the little vent solenoid, the little screen, you can see it clogged completely up. And sometimes you can blow that out, but you could actually stick your blower in here, a bunch of dust would come out of here. Well, they came up with a filter. In other words, they have the vent for the thing, even downstream of the vent solenoid, they'd have a really nice big filter that would stop dust from ever getting in here. You know, Ford did that and that kind of thing. So this thing right here is something we used to run into a lot. I don't think it's much of a problem anymore because everybody's pretty well dealt with it. And unless you live in a place where there's a lot of farm community and dust and stuff flooding in the air, you might not have ever seen this anyway. This chalky looking ignition on these coils, just let everybody seen that. The reason that happens is because everywhere you have a spark, a naked spark, it's creating ozone as well as RFI. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But this ozone that is created and trapped in there where it can't go anywhere, ozone is O3, it's 3 molecules of oxygen bound together, and it is extremely corrosive and begins to oxidize that. And you'll also see it in these plug wires. And basically what that means is you've had, for a while, you have had a bad wire that's got naked sparks inside because it has burned the little, you know, the fiber core of that wire out, and it's having to jump. And when it traps that stuff in there, it's going to look rusty and oxidized and all that because of that ozone. On some of the gray distributor caps that Ford came out with, they had to put a vent in the distributor cap to let the ozone out because it would react with that gray material and make some gummy clear stuff that kind of looked like moisture and acted like moisture in that cap. It was only on the gray caps though. Of course, if you put a black cap on there, it's really bad to carbon track. And then Chrysler had some brown caps that weren't so bad to, you know, that were less likely to carbon track than those phenolic black ones. Those black ones were real pretty and shiny, but boy, they'd carbon track up a storm, and here you'd be pulling plug wires to see which one was missing, and whenever you'd pull one of them, the engine would run better. I was working at the Volkswagen place over here, when was it, 1983, and this older mechanic that was probably 10 years older than me, he was over working on a car that had a distributor, and he was thinking out loud, he pulled the spark plug wires off looking for a skip, And when he pulled one of them off, the engine picked up speed. And he goes, why does it run better when I pull a plug wire off? Well, I learned that working at a gas station. I said, you got a carbon track in your distributor cap. What's wrong with that? So he pulled it off, and look, sure enough, there's a big carbon track in there. And you know, they always used to say that if you, how'd they put that? If you made a pencil mark in a distributor cap, it would jump fire and all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, in other words, it would cause it to crossfire, kind of like a carbon track. I was going to try that, make me a bug for some of my students when I went to work at the college. I colored all in a distributor cap, never could get in the area, get it to run bad at all. Beat all I'd ever seen. All right, this right here was a teaching tool that I put together using the parts from a 98 Ford Explorer so that you can see fuel injection work right there on the board. You might notice I've got a fan here, like a computer fan, that's pulling air through this throttle body so that whenever you open the throttle body, you'd see the airflow increase. And you could also watch the injector if you hooked up a scope. See, I played for a scan tool down here to hook up to it. And I actually labeled all of these pins, and there was one of these components, and I'd have my students wire that up, and then whenever you would turn the key, it would start this spinning, and you'd get your injector pulse, and you could see, I put an LED with each injector so you could see them blinking all at the same time. I've actually got a video that I linked to on my YouTube channel, and you can see this thing working. Now whenever I turn that key and it starts, you can see it blinking all of the lights at the same time. This video is actually on my YouTube channel if you'll just look up the word fuel injection and see how they started flashing sequentially after it picked up speed. And and there's a little spinning next to the crank sensor. I had a button down there you had to push to shut it all down. And I got a little funny story about that. See them sparks popping up there? One time I had a good strong battery connected to this thing, and I wanted to just keep talking about it while I was standing there next to this board talking about it while I was teaching my class. And I stood there with that thing with them sparks popping and with that wheel spinning, and I was just talking and talking and talking. And what I wound up doing while I was talking to them and all that sparks were popping, I must have been talking for 5 minutes, I started getting kind of lightheaded. It was crazy as all get out that I got as lightheaded as I did because I was breathing that ozone. I didn't think about it. You could kind of smell it, you know, it smells like a burnt motor or something. But I was breathing that ozone, and I started getting kind of lightheaded, and I had enough presence of mind to know that I was breathing the ozone that was coming off those naked sparks. You know, that was just incredibly, you know, duh-head. I mean, the only time that ever happened. But I was thinking, you know, somebody want to get oxygen drunk. I guess that's the way they could do it. How about the JB welders? How many times you get a vehicle before you come in there, somebody had a coolant leak or something like that, or even an oil leak or whatever, and they cleaned it off real good with brake parts cleaner, just smeared JB Weld all over it. You got to work around that stuff. It's a kind of a mess, and you're never going to be able to, unless you replace the components, you're not going to be able to have a really nice looking job. You're just going to have a job where you replaced a part, had to tap the threads out, you know, it was pipe threads, and put a really good looking part in there with a crappy old JB Weld all around it when you get done. As long as it doesn't leak, it don't matter, I guess. But I don't know at the times I've seen people use JB Weld. There's all kinds of stories people have about JB Weld too, about how they, you know, built a piston out of JB Weld and cut ring grooves in it and drove it all the way to Montana or whatever. But you know, I'm talking about these crazy JB Weld stories and all. This right here, believe it or not, is a pipe that was in my kitchen. This thing had been in there for 52 years because I know when this house was built, and it was leaking right here, just dripping out right here, because that pipe had rusted. Now right here you can kind of see where I've temporarily, just to give me a little chance to, you know, gather my materials and get ready to fix it and put some time aside, I put some black electrical tape, wrapped it around there to kind of, it's just a drain, you know, coming from the kitchen sink going into the wall. And so I wrapped that tape around it, and I got that thing, but I cut the tape off of it on a Saturday morning, last Saturday morning as a matter of fact. And I mean, not the Saturday morning that's the last one to y'all because you're going to be watching this on Monday. It was Saturday, it was a week ago by the time you get to watching this. But anyway, I went ahead and cut that tape off of there, and I says, you know, I'm going to have a pipe wrench. At first I kind of half-heartedly tried to do it with this 12-inch rigid pipe wrench I've got. And I said, there ain't no way. Ain't no way. That's an 1.5-inch pipe. It's been in there 52 years. It's rusty and cruddy. And so I went to Harbor Freight and I paid $32 for this aluminum 24-inch pipe wrench. You know, I started to get one that was a 14-inch or something. I said, no, 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 I need to go ahead and get this big one. And I got in there and I put that sucker on there, and I managed to, you know, like I was bench pressing something, I got into there and pushed up on it, screwed it out of there. And that's what the pipe looked like. Now the problem I had was the threads were all screwed up, because look up here. You see how some of that pipe stayed in there? And so I got these threads, and I went back and did it better than what this picture shows, but I got those threads and I got my high-speed cutter, and I cut it at an angle and turned that piece of pipe into a thread chaser, which I've done that with bolts and pipes and stuff like that for a long time, years and years and years. Dad taught me that back in the 70s. And I managed to use that piece of pipe and that pipe wrench to start that thing in there, and I managed to fix those threads where I could put the new piece of pipe in there. And so there's the new piece of pipe with the Teflon tape on it. And since pipe thread is tapered, I just, you know, screwed it on in there and let her run water through it. And if it was dripping a little bit, I kept tightening it up till the leak stopped. As pipe thread is tapered, and it's designed to do that. Because of pipe thread being tapered, you'll always see some threads even when you get it in there as far as it needs to go. And so, of course, I bought new plastic stuff to go on the other side. Anyway, that is the shop. Back in the day, whenever I was working over there, I built these trainer strands for them to take brake shoes off and put them back on. I would demonstrate getting those shoes off and back on using the tools in about 3.5 minutes, and then I would tell them to beat my time, you know. And a lot of times they would just do it for the fun of it and get really good at it. That's where you're measuring brake drums. We were teaching brakes that semester, I guess. This right here was a hybrid vehicle battery that I had that I got from the Toyota place that the warranty didn't want. And we actually did some, you know, teaching a little hybrid stuff we would do on that. And then that's the front end area over there. And I got these big fans mounted up there so we could blow on the stalls and all that. And that GMC over there is a trainer vehicle that a guy had donated. I don't remember what was going on here, but this was a customer's car. That was one of the trainer vehicles too. I got this Lincoln hose reel to replace one of those. And I think that was the brand name was Samson. It was a really, really good hose reel. That Lincoln hose reel was the most disappointing thing I ever bought compared to those heavy-duty Samson hose reels. I couldn't believe how sorry it was. But anyway, I had a bunch of old batteries under here we would test and all that kind of thing. And you know, so, and you got to have a floor jack. Even if you got lifts all over the shop, it's a good idea to have a floor jack because sometimes you need one. There's parts washer over there. It was one of those aqueous parts washers from Safety Clean. I really enjoyed that, but it was expensive every 6 weeks when they came to replace the juice in it. Anyway, that is all for today, and I really appreciate you guys listening to me ramble on, as Mike Ponder says, and we will talk to you next time.